So this is going to be a video about making equivalent statements with the sign ratios. This one I'm looking at the homework set of problems, but the process will apply to all of them. So to start, I want to be clear about the quadrants. So we have our 4 quadrants. And since we're only talking about sine of angles, when the sine of the angle is in quadrant 1 or quadrant 2, your ratio is positive. That gives you a positive y over r. When you're in quadrant 3 or 4, that gives you a negative y over r ratio. So when I look at my statements, and I'm going to draw some pictures. So let's do number 1 like this. Sine of negative 75, this negative says go clockwise 75 degrees. That puts me in quadrant 4. So I get a negative y over r ratio for sine of negative 75. This negative just tells me the location. This quadrant tells me the negative coefficient. So for the next blank, I need this blank to equal a negative y over r from here. So for this outcome to be negative, I have to choose quadrant 3 or quadrant 4 because that's the 2 quadrants that give me a negative sign ratio. So I'll do both. So quadrant 3, I have this reference angle. So that's 180 plus 75. Quadrant 4, there's the quadrant 3. Quadrant 4, this is my angle of rotation, with 75 degrees. So that's 360 minus 75. And you can use your calculator for the arithmetic. So we get 255 or 285. And if you want to check, sine of negative 75 is negative 0.96. Sorry, there's a glare. There we go. So if I do sine of 255, I should get the same value. If I do sine of 285, I should get the same value. All 3 have that same ratio of negative 0.96 and all those decimals. Okay, now the next blank. Negative sine of an angle has to give me a negative y over r. Well, I already have a negative coefficient, and I need a negative outcome. So this statement has to come from a positive angle so that my positive times negative is negative. So that's either quadrant 1 or quadrant 2. Quadrant 1 gives me an answer of 75. Quadrant 2 gives me this angle of 180 minus, 75, not 175. And you get 105 degrees. So now if I recheck my equivalency, those 2 angles still give me the correct decimals. There we go. And then lastly, negative sine of an angle. And don't worry about this part yet. The first thing we have to pick is the appropriate quadrant. So with this negative coefficient, when I want a negative outcome, here, like the original, I need a negative times a positive ratio, so from either quadrant 1 or quadrant 2. So quadrant 1 puts my reference angle here. Quadrant 2 puts it over here, but the negative angle means go clockwise. So starting on the initial ray, my angle of rotation goes in the opposite direction clockwise. So quadrant 1 would give me a negative angle of 360 minus 75, and quadrant 2 would give me an angle of 180 plus 75. So your answers here are either negative 285 from quadrant 1 or negative 255 from quadrant 2. Okay, let's do another one. Let's do number 2. Sine of negative 103. So my first item is I have to find where is this terminal ray. Hi, thank you. So we go clockwise. So that's a reference angle of 77. Sorry, I was getting a delivery. Okay, so 77 degrees is my reference angle, but since this is in quadrant 3, my original statement that I'm starting with is a negative ratio. So now, sine of blank, I need that to be a negative ratio, a negative y over r. So I have to pick quadrant 3 or quadrant 4 since I need this entire outcome to be negative and I have no coefficient to change that. So here is my 77 degrees in quadrant 3. Here's my 77 degrees in quadrant 4. I'm going to go counterclockwise. So that is either 180 plus 77 or 360 minus 77. So these two answer choices are 257 or 283. So something interesting here, this negative 103 angle is coterminal with 257 degrees. They have the same terminal ray. So coterminal is another important concept from this unit. There's no limit to how many times I can use quadrant 3 in my answer. So just because quadrant 3 was here, I can use quadrant 3 here just with a different angle value. Okay, so now let's do the next one. Negative sine of an angle. I need that to be a negative y over r. So, since I have a negative coefficient and I need a negative outcome, I need this part to be a positive y over r so that when I multiply by the negative, I get negative. So that's in quadrant 1 or quadrant 2. So 77 degrees is one answer. It's my quadrant 1 angle. Or 103 degrees if you pick the quadrant 2 angle. And then, oh, this last blank is the same blank as the one before, so I'm going to put my quadrant 2 in the second answer over there. All right, let's do one more. Let's do sine of 45. That is in the first quadrant. So this is a positive y over r. So when I do sine of the angle for the next blank, I need the other positive quadrant. So this angle is 135 degrees. Now for this one, negative sine of an angle. First I have to pick my quadrant. I need a positive ratio. I have a negative coefficient. So negative from the coefficient times a negative ratio gives me the positive outcome that I need to match the original problem. So this comes from quadrant 3 or quadrant 4. However, there's a negative in the angle location, so I have to go clockwise. So my answer choices here are either negative 45 degrees or negative 135 degrees. And then the last blank is negative sine. So I need negative of a negative to turn to positive to match my original. So this happens in quadrant 3 or quadrant 4. But I have to rotate counterclockwise. So this is 180 plus 45, where this is 360 minus 45. I hope that's helpful. Sorry about the interruptions or the pausing.